Living in a quiet suburban neighborhood was supposed to be a dream come true. Tree-lined streets, manicured lawns, and friendly neighbors painted the picture of a peaceful, community-focused life. That dream, however, had begun to unravel the moment Karen moved in. She was the kind of neighbor whose presence immediately altered the neighborhood's energy, an air of entitlement clinging to her with every step, every complaint, every disapproving glare. From day one, she scrutinized every detail of the houses around her, always finding something to object to, something to control. And in a community governed by an HOA that prided itself on rules and order, Karen found her perfect weapon. Endless complaints at IT began subtly. A misplaced flower pot here, a slightly untidy lawn there. Minor infractions, nothing serious, but enough for Karen to make her presence known. She would write long, meticulously detailed letters to the HOA, documenting the violations with a fervor that suggested she believed herself to be the neighborhood's moral compass. The HOA, for its part, seemed to respond with a combination of politeness and passive resistance. Letters would be acknowledged but rarely acted upon. Complaints were logged and filed, but rarely did anyone enforce consequences. For the homeowner, it was frustrating. Each week brought another letter from Karen. Each letter carried escalating accusations, from claims about illegal garden structures to baseless statements about noise violations. The homeowner followed every rule to the letter, yet the stress of being constantly watched began to weigh heavily. At first, the complaints seemed trivial, almost laughable, like the petty obsessions of a neighbor who had nothing better to do. But as time passed, the constant pressure created a creeping anxiety. Every movement, every change in the yard, every outdoor activity had to be measured against Karen's watchful eyes. The homeowner reached out to the HOA multiple times, seeking resolution, fairness, and even mediation. Each attempt was met with vague assurances, forms to fill, and reminders of procedure. The HOA had the authority, yet it lacked the willingness to enforce it. Karen, on the other hand, grew bolder. She began showing up uninvited, monitoring the yard in real time, taking pictures, sometimes even recording video to prove alleged violations. It became clear that her goal wasn't just to enforce rules but to dominate, to control the lives of those around her. Weeks turned into months, and the homeowner's frustration grew into a quiet, simmering determination. It was clear that relying on the HOA alone would accomplish nothing. They had dismissed the complaints as inconsequential, bureaucratic red tape their only concern. The homeowner realized that if justice was to be served, it could only come through strategy, intelligence, and careful planning. They began documenting everything, meticulously recording Karen's activities, her patterns, and the exaggerations she presented as truth. It was not out of paranoia, but necessity. Technology became an ally. Security cameras, motion sensors, and discreet observation provided a clear record of reality, contrasting sharply with Karen's version of events. The homeowner began creating a comprehensive log, complete with time-stamped evidence, photographs, and video clips. Each complaint from Karen could now be cross-referenced with incontrovertible proof of its inaccuracy. The homeowner was no longer reacting, they were preparing for a moment when the scales of justice could finally tip. Karen, of course, continued her campaign undeterred. She emailed the HOA with accusations that grew increasingly absurd. One week, it was a claim that the homeowner's newly planted shrubs were obstructing a sight line. Another week, she alleged that outdoor furniture violated aesthetic codes, despite prior approvals and similar setups in other yards. Her obsession intensified, but so did the homeowner's careful observation. Every lie, every exaggeration, every attempt to manipulate the HOA was cataloged. Neighbors began noticing the tension. Some whispered about Karen's relentless scrutiny, while others marveled at the homeowner's composure in the face of relentless harassment. A few even began to record incidents on their own phones, quietly contributing to the growing dossier of evidence. It became increasingly clear that Karen's influence, while initially intimidating, was beginning to isolate her. She had turned her campaign against a single homeowner into a spectacle, But the community was slowly realizing that the narrative she was spinning was far from the truth. The turning point came when the homeowner uncovered a critical inconsistency. Karen had submitted a complaint alleging that the homeowner's backyard light installation violated HOA rules, claiming the lights were too bright and intrusive. But the homeowner's security footage showed that the lights had been on for years, identical to the day before Karen moved in, and had never been an issue. The footage also captured Karen herself examining the lights, then walking away without filing a complaint at the time, clearly indicating a premeditated motive. It was the kind of undeniable proof that could not be ignored. With this realization, the homeowner began to outline a larger plan. The goal was no longer just to survive Karen's harassment. It was to expose her publicly and convincingly. Everything that Karen had attempted to manipulate would now be turned into evidence of her own obsession and dishonesty. But to succeed, precision was crucial. Timing, presentation, and strategy mattered more than ever. A single misstep could backfire, turning the tables once again in Karen's favor. By the end of the chapter, the homeowner had transformed from a passive target into a calculated strategist. They were ready to act, equipped with proof, technology, and a meticulous plan that would finally force the HOA and the neighborhood to see Karen for who she truly was. The stage was set for a confrontation that would not only resolve the homeowner's plight but send shockwaves through the entire community. And so, with evidence compiled, cameras rolling, and patience honed to a razor's edge, the homeowner waited. Karen's relentless campaign of complaints had set the scene perfectly, leaving her vulnerable to exposure in a way she could never anticipate. The quiet suburban streets that had once been a source of peace were now the arena for a battle of truth versus obsession. The first move had been made, but the game was only beginning. The morning began like any other, quiet and deceptive. The suburban streets bathed in soft sunlight. But for the homeowner, this day was far from ordinary. Months of preparation, observation, and documentation had all led to this moment. The evidence was ready, the cameras strategically positioned, and the community quietly aware that something was about to unfold. What had started as a personal battle against harassment had now evolved into a carefully orchestrated revelation. A showdown between truth and obsession. Karen, oblivious to the homeowner's plan, continued her daily routines with the same sense of self-importance. She would patrol the neighborhood, scrutinize landscaping, and make notes in her ever-growing stack of complaint forms. Each action, each gesture, each obsessive check-in was being captured silently by the homeowner's discreet cameras. Every move that Karen made now contributed to the narrative that would soon expose her in full clarity. The homeowner began the day by reviewing the compiled evidence one final time. Photographs of absurd complaints, video footage of Karen contradicting herself, and logs of prior interactions with the HOA formed a comprehensive dossier. Every detail had been cross-checked and cataloged. Each complaint Karen had submitted was systematically countered with proof of its inaccuracy or irrelevance. The homeowner's approach was meticulous, leaving no room for ambiguity or denial. This was not just revenge. It was undeniable, irrefutable documentation of Karen's obsession and manipulation. The next step was subtle but powerful: community engagement. The homeowner knew that exposing Karen solely through the HOA's channels might not carry the impact needed. The broader neighborhood had to see the pattern, the repeated harassment, the obsessive behavior. Flyers were quietly distributed, and friendly neighbors were subtly made aware of the evidence. Social media groups within the community began to notice patterns that had previously gone unspoken. For the first time, whispers of doubt about Karen's integrity started circulating, each observation supported by tangible evidence. Meanwhile, the homeowner set a trap, carefully designed to ensure Karen would incriminate herself once more. It involved a minor, perfectly legal adjustment to their yard, a new garden sculpture that adhered to all HOA guidelines. The homeowner anticipated that Karen would escalate, submitting a complaint that would be impossible to substantiate. Cameras captured her approach, her examination, and her documentation attempts. As expected, Karen filed another complaint, complete with exaggerations and misleading claims. But this time, the homeowner had every angle covered. The camera footage contradicted every statement she made, capturing her scrutinizing areas that were already compliant, her gestures exaggerated for effect, and her face betraying frustration when nothing was actually wrong. The HOA, now faced with undeniable proof, could no longer ignore the situation. They had initially dismissed the homeowner's complaints as minor or bureaucratic, but the evidence was irrefutable. The homeowner's dossier highlighted repeated false claims, documented patterns of harassment, and clear contradictions in Karen's statements. The HOA administrators, usually cautious and slow to act, were compelled to review the files seriously. For the first time, Karen's reputation within the HOA was at risk, and the power dynamic that had tormented the homeowner for months began to shift. The homeowner also understood the power of optics. The goal was not only to vindicate themselves, but to reveal Karen's behavior in a way that could not be denied by the community. Footage from cameras, time-stamped evidence, and carefully organized comparisons were compiled into a compelling narrative. Each frame, each photograph, each timeline piece was designed to clearly demonstrate that Karen's complaints were not based on reality, but on personal obsession and an inflated sense of authority. When presented in the right order, the story became undeniable, leaving little room for doubt as the day progressed. Subtle tension rippled through the neighborhood. Neighbors who had quietly sympathized with the homeowner began to notice the discrepancy between Karen's complaints and reality. Some witnessed the homeowner calmly explaining the situation. Others observed the security footage being displayed during informal gatherings. Each interaction reinforced the narrative. Karen's claims were exaggerated, selective, and often contradictory. Her credibility, carefully cultivated over months of aggressive complaining, began to erode visibly. Karen, in her habitual manner, remained unaware of the growing scrutiny surrounding her. She continued her patrols, oblivious that the homeowner's plan was not only working but thriving. Each new complaint she filed added to the body of evidence that would ultimately expose her. The homeowner had created a system where Karen's obsession was self-documented, her own actions serving as proof of her manipulations. It was a strategic brilliance born from patience and careful observation. Turning the aggressor's energy against herself. By evening, the homeowner initiated the final phase. The compiled evidence, now impossible to ignore, was formally submitted to the HOA. The presentation was thorough. Video clips, photographs, timestamps, and logs, all arranged to demonstrate a consistent pattern of harassment. The HOA administrators, faced with irrefutable proof, had no choice but to act. Letters were sent, fines were levied, and official notices were issued against Karen for her repeated violations of HOA rules and harassment policies. For the first time, she faced consequences for the actions she had wielded as power over others. The neighborhood watched in a mix of astonishment and satisfaction. Karen's relentless campaign, once a source of fear and frustration, had been dismantled through meticulous planning and undeniable evidence. The homeowner's reputation was not only restored but elevated. Their patience, strategy, and intelligence had transformed them from a target into a figure of quiet authority. The story spread quickly, shared among neighbors, circulated in community groups, and eventually became a talking point for the broader neighborhood. Karen, who had sought to dominate, found herself the subject of scrutiny and discussion. Her influence shattered, and yet, even in victory, the homeowner remained measured. There was no gloating, no spectacle beyond what was necessary. The objective had been exposure and accountability, and that had been achieved. The neighborhood had witnessed the consequences of unchecked obsession, and the homeowner had set a precedent. Rules exist to ensure fairness, and no one, not even a self-appointed enforcer, is above them. As the night descended, calm returned to the quiet streets, but the atmosphere had changed irrevocably. Karen, now wary and cautious, had lost her aura of control. The homeowner had reclaimed their peace, but more importantly, they had demonstrated the power of patience, documentation, and strategy in the face of harassment. The stage was set for the final chapter, the aftermath, the consequences, and the viral impact of a carefully executed plan of revenge. The days following the HOA's decisive action were charged with an unusual energy. The quiet suburban neighborhood, usually insulated from drama, became a hub of whispers, curiosity, and observation. Karen, once the relentless enforcer of perceived rules, now moved through the streets with a cautious, defensive posture. Her confidence had evaporated, replaced by uncertainty. Every glance from a neighbor, every subtle acknowledgement of her recent humiliation, reminded her that the balance of power had shifted irreversibly. The homeowner, on the other hand, felt a calm sense of vindication. Months of frustration, anxiety, and careful preparation had culminated in a definitive resolution. The HOA had levied fines, issued formal warnings, and documented Karen's repeated violations. More importantly, the neighborhood now had a record, an unmistakable narrative of obsession and manipulation laid bare. What had been a personal battle had grown into a community lesson. Unchecked complaints and harassment could not go unchallenged, and careful strategy could expose even the most determined adversary. Social media, both local neighborhood groups and wider platforms, began to carry fragments of the story. Neighbors, initially hesitant to speak, started sharing screenshots of emails, photos of absurd complaints, and anecdotes that confirmed the homeowner's meticulous documentation. The story was compelling. A once-ignored victim of relentless harassment had turned the tables, exposing Karen in a way that was irrefutable and publicly visible. Within days, posts detailing the situation garnered hundreds of comments, likes, and shares. People were captivated by the drama, fascinated by the strategy, and vindicated in seeing justice served. Karen's response was predictable yet futile. She attempted to defend herself, claiming misunderstandings, misinterpretations, and errors in documentation. But the evidence was overwhelming. Time-stamped videos, photos, and detailed logs had already solidified the narrative. Each attempt she made to dispute the facts only reinforced the broader story. Her own obsessive behavior had been her undoing. The HOA, now aware of the viral spread of the story, supported the homeowner's position publicly, emphasizing the importance of rules, fairness, and community accountability. Karen's complaints were no longer credible, and her influence diminished to near invisibility. The neighborhood's reaction was equally instructive. Conversations on porches, in yards, and on community boards revolved around the story. The homeowner, once a silent target of harassment, became a symbol of strategic patience and resilience. Neighbors expressed admiration for the meticulous way the homeowner had handled the situation, balancing calm documentation with careful planning. Karen's reputation suffered not just within the HOA but socially. Invitations were rescinded, conversations avoided, and subtle but pervasive skepticism colored every interaction she attempted. The very persona she had cultivated as the moral arbiter of the community had been dismantled publicly and permanently. Yet, the story's impact extended beyond personal revenge. It became a cautionary tale for the HOA itself. Administrators, who had once ignored the homeowner's repeated pleas, recognized the necessity of diligence, accountability, and fairness. Procedures were revised to prevent similar harassment in the future. Complaint processes were clarified, with requirements for evidence and verification before action could be taken. The homeowner's efforts had not only secured personal justice but had prompted institutional change. An enduring legacy of vigilance, fairness, and transparency. Karen's behavior, now under scrutiny, continued to unravel. Former allies within the neighborhood distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with someone whose credibility had been publicly destroyed. The homeowner's strategy had not relied on confrontation alone but on subtle, undeniable exposure. By documenting and presenting the truth, the homeowner allowed the narrative to speak for itself. Karen's own actions had created the viral story, a narrative so compelling that the community collectively recognized it without needing persuasion. The homeowner, meanwhile, maintained a quiet presence. There was no celebratory spectacle, no overt gloating. The strategy had been to let evidence speak for itself, and it had done so with resounding clarity. The viral nature of the story, spread across neighborhood groups and social media platforms, reinforced the lesson. Deliberate observation, careful planning, and precise execution can overcome harassment and obsession, even from the most relentless individuals. The homeowner's name became synonymous with patience, intelligence, and strategic thinking. Months later, the neighborhood had settled into a new rhythm. Karen, while still present, was a shadow of her former self. Her complaints dwindled, her scrutiny was less aggressive, and her influence waned. The homeowner continued to maintain their yard, their property, and their peace with the knowledge that justice had been achieved not through confrontation alone, but through methodical preparation and unwavering resolve. The quiet streets, once a backdrop for relentless harassment, had been reclaimed as a space of fairness and respect. The story of Karen and the homeowner became a benchmark for HOA communities far beyond their own street. Online forums, discussion groups, and community pages shared the tale as a lesson in persistence, evidence-based action, and strategic patience. Other homeowners found inspiration, learning that harassment could be countered effectively, that rules could be enforced fairly, and that even the most obsessive adversaries could be exposed through careful planning. In the end, the homeowner's journey was a testament to resilience. Months of harassment had tested their patience, composure, and intelligence, yet they had emerged victorious. Karen, who had once wielded fear and intimidation as her weapons, had been neutralized by the very tools she had ignored: truth, evidence, and strategy. The viral story, spread across screens and neighborhoods, immortalized the homeowner's triumph, ensuring that the lesson and the victory would not be forgotten. Peace returned to the suburban streets, but it was a peace born of strategy, vigilance, and perseverance. The homeowner had reclaimed their life, their property, and their community, proving that justice, when pursued with intelligence and patience, could prevail even against the most relentless adversary. And in that quiet victory, the neighborhood found both resolution and a story to be told for years to come.